the worship and the teaching that happened every Sunday night. It was more of a teaching than a sermon. Well, one week the teacher who was scheduled couldn't make it. And I guess the clergy were all busy because they called me. I guess they figured he's going to seminary, he's got something maybe he could share with us. And of course I had three different emotions going through my mind. One, I was terrified, being the first time I would teach in the church. Two, I was also excited about the fact that I was going to teach in the church. And then three, I was perhaps shading a little towards having a bit of pride that they might have called me to preach in the church or teach. And so I did. And I remember teaching that night, and some of the youth group members were there that I had grown up with, and of course they gave me a little bit of a hard time about it afterwards. So I was waiting for that next call, to teach again, thinking, well, they're going to schedule me for a series, right? There's that pride that's creeping in right there. And, the funny thing was, they never called me again. And it took me a while to realize what was going on, but I was like, okay, well, Lord, you know what you're doing. Well, in today's gospel, we see something kind of similar happening. James and John had spent 3 years under the teaching of Jesus and doing ministry with him, and they were part of what you might call the inner circle. You see, only 3 apostles went on top of that mountain with Jesus, Peter, James, and John, when he was revealed, Jesus, in all of his glory. And Elijah and Moses showed up, and they were having a little conversation. And so I'm sure John and James went home and told Mom all about it, right? I mean, this was some major deal. We were the ones chosen to be on the mountain with Peter and Jesus. And so here comes Mom with kids in tow. Hey, Jesus, can these guys sit, on the chairs next to you when you come into your throne? I mean, she was just, and obviously he couldn't, as we all know, couldn't grant that request because it wasn't for him to say. But the other 10, they had an interesting reaction, did they not? They were indignant with those guys, that they had the gumption to come forward and ask this audacious request. I can imagine James and John having to deal with that same kind of spiritual pride that had creeped in with me in those early days, and I still battle with from time to time. But here's the thing, and as I was praying about today and what to talk about, and the Lord pointed out an interesting thing that we don't often kind of focus on when we look at this particular passage. Even though they had committed this major faux pas, if you will, and this, showed their pride, and we want to be sitting right next to you in your kingdom, God still chose to use them. And even though I might have had some pride going on in those early days, God chose to use me all these years. And that's what He does. Regardless of our state, when we come to Him in faith and we turn our lives over to Christ, He can use us. Maybe we're a person that's prone to depression or anxiety. Maybe we don't feel like we have really anything to offer the Lord. Maybe we struggle with anger or some other problem. He can still use us. And He does. And there's countless stories to illustrate that, but I chose this one that I ran into, this morning as I was preparing. I'm just going to read this because it's so well written. What a difficult life She was the 25th child in a dissenter's family. Though brilliant, she procured little education. Though strong-willed, she lived in a male-dominated age. She married an older man and bore him 19 children. 9 of them died. Her house burned down. Her barn fell down. Her health failed, and she lived with a wolf at the door. Samuel and Susanna married in 1689 and began pastoring in a dreary little church in Epworth in 1697. They served there 40 years, enduring hardships such as these. Samuel's salary was so small, and he was so incapable of managing it, that he was thrown into debtor's prison, leaving Susanna to fend for herself. The two were so strong-willed and argumentative that Samuel once prayed for the king and waited for Susanna's amen. She didn't say it. "I do not believe the Prince of Orange to be the king," she said spiritedly. "Then you and I must part," replied Samuel, "for if we have 2 kings, we must have 2 beds." They separated, to be reunited only after the king's death. They also disagreed about Susanna's ministry, for her Bible lessons drew more listeners than his sermons. Susanna gave birth to a daughter during the election of 1705. The nurse, exhausted by overnight revelry, slept so heavily the next morning that she rolled on the baby and smothered it. Susanna herself was often bedfast, having to delegate home duties to the children, but several of her children were so wayward that she called them a constant affliction. Her brother, having promised her a sizable gift, disappeared mysteriously and was never heard from again. Finally, on July 21st, 1731, Susanna described an accident in which her horses stampeded, throwing Samuel from their wagon and injuring him so that he was never well from that day. A difficult life. And yet, in that parsonage at Epworth was destined to become the most celebrated in English history, for from it came 2 of the greatest evangelists of all time, John and Charles Wesley. And the mother who raised them shook the world. You see, even in those incredibly difficult circumstances that most of us would have just been crushed by, she raised 2 men that wound up bringing countless thousands, if not millions, of people to Christ. And as the description said, they shook the world. So you just never know how God is calling each one of us to serve Him.